The call came in on a Tuesday morning at 8:47 a.m. A welfare check. Nothing urgent, nothing alarming. The kind of call Deputy Karen Ostrowski had answered dozens of times before. A concerned neighbor on Birchwood Lane in Cloverdale, population 11,200, had called to say that Mr. Gregory Dalton, the 5th grade science teacher at Cloverdale Elementary, hadn't shown up to school. His car was in the driveway. His lights were on, but he wasn't answering the door or his phone. Principal Sandra Reeves had called the non-emergency line herself. She said Gregory Dalton had never missed a day in 9 years without calling ahead. 9 years. Not once. Deputy Ostrowski noted the address, 312 Birchwood Lane, and drove over expecting to find a man with the flu, maybe a fall in the bathroom, maybe a medical scare. That's usually what welfare checks turn out to be. She had no reason to think this one would be any different. Cloverdale is the kind of town people describe as a good place to raise a family. Situated in the rolling farmland of the county's western edge, it has a main street with a bakery, a hardware store, and a pharmacy that still fills prescriptions by name. There's one elementary school, one middle school, and a high school that gets written up every few years for having an unusually good science program. The crime blotter in the local paper usually features things like mailbox vandalism and noise violations from the county fairgrounds. Parents let their kids ride bikes to the park 2 blocks over. It is, by almost every measure, a quiet town. Gregory Dalton had fit into that quiet perfectly. He had arrived in Cloverdale 9 years ago from a teaching position downstate, hired mid-year to finish out a contract after the previous science teacher retired unexpectedly. Within 1 semester, he was considered one of the best teachers in the district. By year 3, parents were requesting his class specifically. He coached the after-school science club for 6 years. He organized the annual Cloverdale Elementary Science Fair, which drew families from 3 neighboring towns every spring. He was the kind of teacher kids came back to visit when they got to high school, when they got to college, when they had kids of their own. Over 9 years at Cloverdale Elementary, approximately 1,400 students had passed through his classroom. Parents trusted him completely. The town trusted him completely. Deputy Ostrowski knocked on the door of 312 Birchwood Lane at 9:14 a.m. The house was a modest 2-story on a quiet residential block. Maintained, unremarkable, the kind of house that blends into a street without drawing any attention. A row of 6 similar houses ran down to the left. 3 houses to the right was the Birchwood Lane cul-de-sac, where kids from the neighborhood gathered after school to ride bikes and play in the circle. From the sidewalk, you could see the roof of Cloverdale Elementary's gymnasium 2 blocks north. Students walked past 312 Birchwood Lane every single morning on their way to school, every single day for 9 years. Dalton answered the door on the 3rd knock. He was in a bathrobe, looked pale, and said he'd had a severe migraine and forgotten to call the school. He was apologetic, almost overly so. Said he'd call Principal Reeves right away. Said he was sorry for the fuss. He stood in the doorway and did not invite the deputy inside. Ostrowski noted that he seemed physically fine, no signs of injury or medical distress. She told him the school had been worried. He nodded, thanked her, and began to close the door. That was the moment she noticed something. The smell. It was faint, drifting from the interior of the house. A sharp chemical smell underneath the normal smell of a lived-in home. Not cleaning products, not a gas leak. Something else. Something that triggered a specific trained recognition in the back of Ostrowski's mind from a narcotics identification course she'd completed 3 years prior. She couldn't be certain. She wasn't going to act on a smell alone, but she was not going to walk away from it either. She asked Dalton if she could come in for a moment, just standard procedure for a wellness check, to confirm everything was all right. He said he was fine, she'd seen him, everything was okay. She told him she understood, but she'd appreciate just a moment inside, standard policy when someone hadn't been reachable. He let her in. The living room was ordinary. Stacked papers on the coffee table, school books on the shelves, a half-empty coffee cup. Nothing unusual. Ostrowski moved slowly, making conversation. How long had he had the migraine? Was he on any medication? Did he have anyone who could check on him? He answered in clipped sentences, moving slightly to redirect her attention toward the front of the house, away from the hallway toward the kitchen. She asked to use the restroom. He pointed to a small bathroom off the front hallway. She used it, thanked him, and came back. But walking back toward the living room, she glanced down the kitchen hallway and noticed something that stopped her. A door at the end of the hallway, what would typically be a basement door, had a keypad-style combination lock mounted on the frame. Not a padlock, not a standard interior lock. An electronic keypad. The kind you'd see on a commercial storage unit or a secured office. On a residential basement door, in a teacher's house, on a quiet neighborhood street. She didn't say anything about it immediately. She finished the wellness conversation, told Dalton to feel better, and to call the school. She left through the front door. She sat in her patrol car for 4 minutes. Then she called it in. Sheriff Patrol investigators are trained to follow observations like this carefully and methodically. Deputy Ostrowski had a smell she couldn't dismiss, and a security installation that was completely inconsistent with anything a normal residential basement would require. She documented both in her report and was joined within 40 minutes by Senior Deputy Marcus Webb from the department's Narcotics Liaison Unit. Webb agreed that the description of the chemical smell, particularly its specific sharp, solvent-based character, combined with the anomalous security on the basement door, was sufficient basis to apply for a search warrant. An affidavit was filed. A judge reviewed it. A warrant was signed by 12:30 p.m. Deputies returned to 312 Birchwood Lane at 1:15 p.m. Gregory Dalton, upon being presented with the warrant, became visibly distressed. He asked several times if he needed to call a lawyer. He was told he could do so. He did not immediately make a call. He stood in the doorway in the same bathrobe, and when the deputies indicated they needed to access all areas of the home, including the basement, he sat down on the living room couch and said nothing further. The basement door was secured with the electronic keypad. A locksmith had accompanied the deputies. It took less than 3 minutes to bypass the mechanism. The door opened onto a standard wooden staircase leading down into what appeared, at first glance, to be a normal unfinished basement. Water heater, some storage boxes, a workbench with tools along the far wall. But the air hit them immediately. The chemical smell that had been faint upstairs was sharp and unmistakable in the confined space below. Deputy Webb identified it on the spot. The workbench was real. The storage boxes were real. But the wall behind the workbench, the south-facing wall that should have backed up against the exterior foundation, was not what it appeared to be. Webb noticed it within minutes. The wall panels were newer than the rest of the basement. The seam between the workbench and the wall was too clean, too deliberate. He moved the workbench. It rolled on concealed casters built into its base, and the wall section behind it was revealed to be a hinged door, secured with 2 additional interior bolt locks. The hidden space behind it measured approximately 18 feet wide by 22 feet deep. What the deputies found inside had been operating based on the physical evidence and documentation preserved on site for approximately 4.5 years. The concealed room was a functioning methamphetamine production laboratory. It was not improvised. It was not small scale. It was a sophisticated, climate-controlled, ventilated chemical processing environment built with deliberate planning and maintained with meticulous care. A commercial-grade ventilation system had been installed that vented through a modified section of the home's external ductwork, designed to disperse chemical exhaust at roofline height, minimizing detectable odor at ground level. The electrical system in the hidden room had been separately wired into the home's main panel through a secondary breaker box, allowing the room's significant power draw to be partially obscured in overall consumption records. Chemical storage was organized and labeled. A log, handwritten in a teacher's precise notation, documented production batches going back to early in the 5th year of Dalton's residence in Cloverdale. The log documented 47 discrete production cycles over 4 years and approximately 7 months. The quantities recorded were not consistent with personal use. They were consistent with distribution. Investigators from the County Narcotics Task Force were on scene within 90 minutes of the discovery. The Cloverdale Sheriff's Substation coordinated with state-level drug enforcement to assess the scale. Over the following 36 hours, the investigation expanded outward from 312 Birchwood Lane. A vehicle registered to Dalton was processed. Communication records, obtained through proper legal channels, provided leads across 3 counties. The operation Dalton had been running from his basement, beneath a residential house on a quiet family street, 2 blocks from an elementary school where he taught children, had, over 4.5 years, generated an estimated street distribution value that investigators described as significantly exceeding what anyone in this community would have anticipated. Gregory Dalton was 41 years old. He had lived at 312 Birchwood Lane for 9 years. He had taught science at Cloverdale Elementary for the entirety of that time. He had never received a disciplinary notation. He had won the Cloverdale School District Excellence in Education Award twice, once in his 4th year and once in his 7th. His photograph was on a plaque in the front hallway of Cloverdale Elementary School. Children who were now in high school had given speeches at school board meetings about what a difference he had made in their lives. He was arrested at 3:42 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, charged with manufacture of a controlled substance, possession with intent to distribute, and several additional counts related to the scope of the distribution operation. He was walked out of 312 Birchwood Lane in handcuffs while neighbors stood on their front lawns and watched. The families on Birchwood Lane were notified first, then Cloverdale Elementary, then the school district as a whole. That night, Principal Sandra Reeves, the same woman who had called in the welfare check that morning, sat across from a sheriff's office liaison at a table in the school's conference room and heard the full outline of what had been found 2 blocks from the school's front entrance. She later told investigators she simply could not reconcile the information with what she knew of the person. She had worked alongside Gregory Dalton for 9 years. She had been to his classroom hundreds of times. She had seen him with children. She had written glowing professional evaluations of him. She had nominated him for the District Teaching Award. "I don't have words," she said. "I genuinely do not have words for this." The community of Cloverdale was not prepared for what followed in the days after the arrest. Approximately 1,400 families whose children had passed through Dalton's classroom over 9 years received letters from the school district informing them of the situation and offering counseling resources. The Cloverdale Community Center hosted 2 open information sessions, one on the Thursday following the arrest, one the following Monday, where a sheriff's office representative answered questions from parents alongside school district administrators and a child psychologist brought in by the county. Combined attendance across both sessions was over 600 people. The nature of the questions at those sessions reflected a community trying to process something that didn't fit any framework it had prepared for. Parents wanted to know if their children had been in danger. They wanted to know whether Dalton's classroom activities had been connected in any way to the operation. Investigators assured families that evidence to date indicated the manufacturing operation and distribution activity were separate from Dalton's school conduct, that the hidden room was used at separate times, that the school and the criminal operation were compartmentalized. That assurance helped, though not entirely. Parents who had trusted the school to keep their children safe needed time to work through what that trust now meant. Some parents described allowing their children to stay after school for the science club, the club that Dalton had run for 6 years, the one he organized in his classroom 2 days a week. Others remembered dropping their children at the school for the science fair on Saturday mornings, walking past 312 Birchwood Lane to reach the school parking lot. Several families lived within the same block radius. Their children had walked past that house, on average, more than 1,500 times over the course of a school year. One father, speaking to a local reporter outside the community center session, put it in simple terms. "My daughter's in 7th grade. She's been walking past that house since 2nd grade, every morning for 5 years. That's all I keep thinking about." The Cloverdale Sheriff's Office worked closely with county mental health services to ensure that both community members and school staff had access to appropriate support. Counselors were placed in the elementary school building for 2 weeks following the arrest. The district's student assistance program was expanded. A tip line was established for community members with information related to the broader distribution investigation, and residents were encouraged to come forward. The investigation into the distribution network connected to the Birchwood Lane operation continued into subsequent weeks. Multiple individuals in the county and in 2 adjacent counties were identified through the evidence gathered at 312 Birchwood Lane. The matter was coordinated with state and federal law enforcement agencies given the geographic scope of the distribution evidence. The Cloverdale Sheriff's Office later noted that the discovery had originated from a single observation: the smell Deputy Ostrowski had cataloged on the basis of training she had completed years earlier, combined with a security installation that didn't fit the context of a residential basement door. Neither element, alone, had been definitive. Together, they had been enough to justify the process that followed. In the department's own words, it was an example of how routine training, careful observation, and proper procedure, not dramatic intervention, not a single dramatic tip, are the instruments through which deputies protect the communities they serve. The plaque in the front hallway of Cloverdale Elementary, the one bearing Gregory Dalton's photograph beneath the words "Excellence in Education," was removed within a week of the arrest. The school held age-appropriate conversations with current students, guided by counselors. Children were told, in terms appropriate to their age, that a trusted adult had made choices that were harmful and wrong, and that trusted adults who make those choices are held accountable. The school emphasized in those conversations that the other trusted adults in their lives, teachers, staff, parents, deputies, were there for them. In the weeks following the arrest, several current and former students of Gregory Dalton's science classes won regional science fair placements at their respective middle and high schools. Their wins were celebrated by their families, by their new teachers, and by their peers. Their hard work and their knowledge were their own. Nothing that had happened on Birchwood Lane could change that. The children who walked past 312 Birchwood Lane each morning on their way to school resumed walking that same route, past a house where the curtains were now drawn and a posted notice indicated the property was under legal review. They kept walking to school. They kept learning science. The street looked exactly the same as it always had. That sameness, the way the surface of an ordinary community can hold something hidden for years without the surface ever cracking, is exactly what makes a routine call matter. Deputy Ostrowski had driven to Birchwood Lane expecting to find a sick man and a simple resolution. What her training recognized, what her instincts flagged, what her documentation supported, and what the proper legal process then uncovered had ended an operation that had run for 4 years and 7 months in a house 2 blocks from an elementary school, operated by the person the entire school community trusted to shape their children's understanding of science and the world. That is what Sheriff Patrol represents in communities across this country. Not dramatic raids, not pre-planned takedowns, routine calls, trained eyes, a smell that didn't add up, a door that didn't make sense, the willingness to stop, to document, and to follow a thread, even when the neighborhood looks completely normal and the person at the door is someone every parent in town waved to every morning for 9 years. Sheriff Patrol covers stories exactly like this one, the ones that begin with a welfare check and end with a community learning what it was living next to. If the story you just heard made your neighborhood feel a little different today, that is not a reason for fear. It is a reason to know that trained deputies are in your community every single day, responding to ordinary calls, noticing things that don't add up, and following those observations through the procedures that keep your town safe. Subscribe to Sheriff Patrol for more local law enforcement stories about hidden threats discovered in ordinary communities, where routine calls by trained deputies save lives that towns never knew were at risk. This is a fictional dramatization inspired by law enforcement concepts. No real cases, individuals, or specific locations are depicted. All names, addresses, and identifying details are entirely fictitious.